Welcome back, family. Welcome back. Welcome back. It is another Monday. Thank you for joining us once again on Parent Power Hour, where we are trying to every week bring you the information that you want and that you need about the school system and how to better navigate it. Joined today, we are with Ms. Sally Lee of Teachers Unite. Um, Unfortunately, or we'll see if Tyrone will join us a little bit later. But stay tuned in. Don't leave the feed just because the face of the franchise is not here. He may join us. He is at the protest rally today uh, that started at Camden Yards. We've been talking about equity every week, folks. You've been talking about it. You've been asking us about it, and TDP and Tyrone is representing us down, himself and us down at the protest today. So he may call in. That would be wonderful, but we're just not sure. So no promises. But we are joined by Ms. Sally Lee of Teachers Unite out of New York City. Fortunate again to have another one of New York City's finest to join us when it comes to the educational realm. And we're going to ask her some questions about policing in the school system, which we'll have a good discussion about how it differs from Baltimore City. But first, we're going to start with our connection question. Family, please feel free to chime in on Facebook Live. So, Miss Lee, the question is, what was your least favorite childhood food? And is it still on the least favorite list?
It's an excellent question. Hello, Baltimore. Thanks for having me. I'll say that I was very picky eater. I was one of those kids that wouldn't eat. I definitely barely ate vegetables. I definitely didn't eat anything green, certainly not broccoli. And I am very proud to say that as a grown adult, I eat every vegetable.
Okay. So it was a whole swath of vegetables.
There was a few that maybe I would eat, but not the green ones.
Not the green ones. All right. For me, it was mayo, mayonnaise, and it is the same for me today. It probably is worse now. The thought of it just makes me queasy. But anyway, thank you for sharing that. Family, please chime in with your least favorite food and let us know in the feed and the chat there if you're still averse to those foods that you used to hate as a kid. But getting to seriousness now, Miss Lee. Talking about reopening, it's on everyone's minds and hearts and lips as we head into the fall with schools. And how is New York City handling, discussing, talking about reopening for the fall?
I mean, as far as I understand, it is a confusing mess. I'm pretty busy as a parent of an almost fourth grader and almost sixth grader, and haven't been actually paying as close attention though as I think many others have. But it just the consensus is that there's no information. I'm lucky for one of my son's schools. There's definitely the school itself is reaching out and doing the town halls and saying, this is what we're going to do, But as far as citywide, they've said it's going to be blended, hybrid, maybe 2 days on and off, but that means all teachers are going back. As you, I'm sure, know and can relate to, there's just so many logistical implications, so many health implications. It just seems, in my personal view, it just seems like the writing's on the wall that they're not going to be able to pull it off, which actually breaks my heart because I really want for my children to have some time back at school. But of course, it has to be safe. And that's the bottom line.
Right. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think, if they say sometimes that New York is a microcosm of the country, and what you just said there covers any place from Baltimore. Baltimore, we just had a decision handed down to us, but I mean, just within the Baltimore area, Baltimore, Washington area, even to Virginia, you have a difference. Some places in Fairfax are not going back. They're just going to do virtual. Then there is a hybrid in some places. And it's just like you said. I mean, it is a lot of confusion on what's the best approach, which seems obvious in terms of health, but then also there are other concerns as well. So thank you for that. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Ms. Lee, and Teachers Unite before we get a little bit further in our questions.
Sure. Where to start? I'm the founding director of Teachers Unite, which is a member-led organization of New York City public school educators who are working to resist racism and segregation. Specifically, we work on issues pertaining to what's known as the school to prison pipeline, or the criminalization of Black and brown young people in our schools. We do this We've done this by developing resources around how to build cultures of restorative and transformative justice in our schools, and also around grassroots leadership, really building democratic cultures in our public schools. And we work in campaigns with young people and parents, specifically the Dignity in Schools campaign, which is a national campaign, and there's a local chapter here in New York City, which is, predominantly youth-led organizations and working on issues of city policy regarding discipline, the over-reliance on suspensions, demanding funding for restorative justice, and most recently for police-free schools. And so our members meet in cohorts and often with parents and students as well, and talk about ways to organize in their schools and how to also plug into citywide campaigns. We're about 14 years old, which is crazy as an organization whenever I say it. And yeah, I can tell you more depending on your questions.
Well, thank you. So as important, as crucial as that work is, I would imagine that you've had some delays and some speed bumps since the COVID-19 outbreak. What kind of challenges have you all faced in that?
I have to say, at first with schools closing, you can imagine, just the chaos for everyone just in their personal lives. And then as far as the pandemic and the health impacts, most of our members work in Title I schools that are 90% or over made up of student populations that qualify for free and reduced price lunch. And our members, students and families were the ones, who were hardest hit. We have members whose, huge percentages of their student population lost a family member. And so in the beginning of the shutdown, the silver lining, I will say, as far as our organizational work, is that suddenly, because everyone was home and because our members are privileged enough to have Wi-Fi at home and access to technology, our meetings and our activity amongst our members and our networks skyrocketed. Because New York City is so big, when we have a Brooklyn meeting or Uptown or Bronx meeting, it is still it's a struggle after a day of school for our members to commute to that meeting, even if it's in that region of the city, because we're so big here and spread out. We rely on public transportation for everything. But suddenly folks were not only motivated to connect with like-minded educators, motivated to find outlets to advocate for their students and their school communities, but they were also home and just able to tune in the way we are right now and able to communicate. And so that, in a sense, really, our membership has increased, our activity has increased. And in the beginning, I'd say, our members were really looking at how is this switch to remote learning and Department of Ed, or I'll say DOE probably a lot in this conversation. That's our code, our acronym.
We learned that last time we had a New York cast.
Okay, yeah. You'll have to stop me if I start using acronyms and you don't know what I'm talking about. But DOE issued laptops and iPads to students, and teachers were starting to say, how is this going to increase surveillance? How is social distancing, or at the time, the sort of sheltering in policy, going to bring more police into our students' neighborhoods and terrify them? That those were the ways that our members were seeing a link between the issues that we always work on and what was happening with the pandemic. And then, of course, the protests and the amazing movement to defund NYPD. That's something we had been working, that's been one of our core values for years. And so suddenly all that work just received this fuel injection. And so the difficulty was, we're tiny, we have 2 full-time staff. We've been lucky to have 2 interns this summer, but just how to keep the capacity to match the incredible sort of momentum and outpouring of energy.
All right, thank you. So like you said, your work is very much geared toward school to prison pipeline. Would you mind, and that's a term that we hear a lot, but I don't think we know the intricacies of it. I don't think we know the history of it. And there's a lot of nuance behind it. It's a big phrase. It's a hot phrase, I would call it. But can you give us some background and exactly what that means?
Sure. And I default to that phrase because it's the most commonly used, but there's a lot of, I think, valid criticisms of that phrase. I wouldn't even get into that because I wouldn't know where to start, and we only have so much time. But the school to prison pipeline is a term that activists use to describe a set of policies and practices that disproportionately impact students of color, Black and brown students, and pushing them out of school and towards the criminal justice system, whether that's, towards just having records, open cases, towards, it could be because of a demoralization and a dropping out of school. Or directly into escalations of conflict that would normally be managed by educators that then get moved to the police or towards the criminal justice system. And so I'm thinking of some great resources that could do a bit of an eloquent job of describing that more. I mentioned Dignity in Schools campaign, which is a national coalition. And if anyone wanted to see more resources and they could possibly process, they could go to dignityinschools.org. And that really describe the history. And I think the history is inextricably linked to the growth of the prison industrial complex and the steady growth of private prisons, of criminalizing normal behavior in Black and brown communities. And there's a link to seeing that in the education sphere. And in New York City, what is often pointed to is the move, of course, I'm going to forget the year right now, I think late 90s, when Giuliani, or Mayor Giuliani, moved the school safety agents from being under the auspices of the then Board of Education to under the supervision of the NYPD, the infamous NYPD. And so there's a lot to say about that, but in one sense, that meant that the security agents that, are there to greet people, make sure who's in the building is supposed to be in the building, so on and so forth, they were no longer supervised by the principal of that school. And so, and they had a direct line, however, to local precincts. That also meant that the career ladder, or the mentality of what that role entailed, was not to move into education or to move into student-centered, education or growth as a young person. It meant that that career ladder of that person taking that role was towards, if I want to move up the career ladder, I move into being a beat cop, I move into police cop. So it also, and that's something that we've been talking about, a lot of Teachers Unite in New York City in our most recent campaign, was we want to see those positions. We want to see positions, because also I should say that SSAs in New York City are overwhelmingly Black and brown folks. It's a low paying job in the NYPD. And,
SSA?
sorry, school safety agent, excuse me. And so we want to see positions created for folks from our communities that don't inflate the police force. But I can get more to that later. But that to us in New York City was a particular way that the school to prison pipeline was built and strengthened, because New York City, again, is so large. We're talking about an SSA force, or a school safety agent force, a police force that in and of itself is larger than the police force in, I believe, Houston or in Boston. It's 5,000 people.
Okay.
And so that means funds going in as a sort of subcontract from the Department of Ed now to the NYPD.
Okay, now that's interesting. In Baltimore City, the school resource officers are under the school board. They're not under Baltimore Police Department. So there's a separate entity, if you will, for school police. So now in New York, are the SSAs still under the police, or has it changed, or is it the same?
Well, that's a very, very current question that you're asking, because our coalition, Dignity in Schools Campaign New York, really led by youth organizations, the push was, we don't want a reshuffling of this police force that's still uniformed and still has this role that in many schools can often be very degrading of students. We still have a lot of schools with metal detectors. That's another part of the school to prison pipeline. The youth really were adamant in saying, we don't want these uniformed guards in our schools. We want someone else greeting people at the door. We want a different way of feeling like we're scholars or students when we come into this school. We don't want to be feeling like prisoners, like we're expected to be bringing in weapons and causing trouble. We just want to get rid of this police force. What ended up happening through the city budget process and a lot of pushing was that it was decided, my understanding at this point is that they have been moved to the DOE, so maybe more in the model you're describing. And there is 101 question marks about what that means and what that transition is going to look like. I think, as I mentioned, the students in our coalition were very adamant about saying, we don't want them to be retrained. We want to create new positions that are about health and justice and youth leadership and family advocacy in our schools, positions that are about restorative justice. We don't, and so right now there's enough that the Department of Ed is dealing with right now that I couldn't tell you right now, like where they are in the transition, what it's going to mean, but I can tell you more about what our members are hoping for and want to push for.
Thank you. And so before you answer that question, before you tell me, because I was going to ask you, what are the young people saying more specifically? Let me ask you, how do the school police in New York City function now? How do they operate day to day? What does it look like, in schools?
That's an important question, because it is, of course, different in every school. As I mentioned, my son's one just graduated from an elementary school, but they've both been there, where everyone knows the officer that sits at the front desk, the officers, and they're, someone who helps people move along out of the lobby, not clog the exits, make sure that a child doesn't run out the school in the middle of a day. I think though, our members who are working in high schools, you'll see more of a range of the role that the SSA has, the school safety agent has in the school. Sometimes you'll have teachers have very negative descriptions of SSAs, maybe that sexually harass students, that yell at students, that are, searching students at the door, that are homophobic and display that in ways that criminalize same-sex couples or students in the school, ones that are all too happy to call in the local precinct on issues that could be managed by skilled educators. And so you'll hear those stories. And then you'll also hear stories of the SSAs in my school are actually more accessible to our students because they're actually from their neighborhood. They actually graduated from my high school, whereas all of us teachers, they might say, are mostly white or didn't grow up in this borough or the city even. And they actually have relationships with the students. And, you know, so we'll hear that as well. And so that's been a conversation that we really want to continue having and deepening when we talk about police-free schools, that this isn't about the individuals. This isn't about, you know, blaming SSAs who have played these positive roles. It's about the job itself and how it inflates the prison industrial complex, how it inflates policing in our communities when we want to see another way that communities and neighborhoods can take care of themselves and of each other.
Thank you. And so what is the mandate? What does New York City say the reason is to have police officers in the schools? What is the reason?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, there was, when folks started using the term school to prison pipeline, to go back to that question and just what it means, the understanding at the time was, you know, after the school shooting in Columbine, right, that we saw these metal detectors going up in schools in what we probably then called the inner city, but not in places like Columbine, where you saw a real infusion of counselors and so grief counselors and, you know, every other kind of humane response. And then here we were in 2001, where after 9/11, there's just also that heightened fear of just terrorism of any kind, and this need to have the police as, I think it's an easy argument to make that we need to keep schools safe from these extraordinarily dangerous you know, and violent happenings. But also at the time, you can imagine the justification was gang violence, students, you know, bringing in weapons, and bringing in community violence into the schools. And that is still, I think, why it's always a complicated conversation to have about, should schools have metal detectors? Are they more helpful or less helpful? And let's talk about that. You know, how often are weapons actually found versus how often are students made so late by the wait line to get through the metal detectors that they show up in class demoralized and angry, and then boom, what incident happens in the class? You know, I mean, that you can sort of split the problem either way. So yeah, so I think all those reasons are sort of combined to justify the presence of police and police equipment, surveillance.
Right. Moving back into what you said about some of your members and some of the students, they would like to instead remove the police officers and have different type of personnel within the buildings. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Oh, I can hear myself echoing there, but it's good now. So a few things on that. I mean, one model that I'm always, there's a few models that we are lucky to have members who have been part of schools that have really tried to redefine what safety and security and accountability mean in their schools. So we know of schools where the principal and the faculty have redefined roles for existing staff to be focused on the building of restorative justice initiatives in schools. We, you know, we know schools where principals and staff have put their I mean, this isn't really answering the question, but putting their bodies between their students and police who have come to arrest them. You know, we know schools where they've been by hook or by crook, you know, deciding not to have substitute teachers for a year so that they have enough money to hire a restorative justice coordinator, and the teachers just agree that they'll cover each other when one is absent for the day. And so your question was, what do they want instead of SSAs or instead of removing police? So yes. I think where I was going with that was that our members and our students want to see supportive positions. I'm actually looking at what we mean by hashtag police free schools. I have my page up and folks can see it if they want to go to tinyurl.com/police free schools NYC. And we have a list of bullet points of what we mean. And for example, one is supportive positions that are created that are well paid, do not require a bachelor's degree. These roles require training in de-escalation and restorative justice. These are Department of Ed positions, not external contracts that get, you know, to bring in some nonprofit or some business to be some other new outsourced social emotional learning agent in the school. We want to see students and guests greeted by community members, not law enforcement. We want to see no surveillance technologies such as cameras, scanning, or metal detectors. We want school communities to oversee the hiring and training of this staff so that staff is part of the school community, as opposed to what we have now, where they're hired and trained by NYPD, the notorious NYPD. So those are just a few examples of. Also, I want to make a note about restorative justice, which is that our members who have been leading restorative justice in their schools are adamant about saying this is not just a program, like poof, here's a restorative justice program and your whole school is perfect. It's really a meaningful culture shift. And it's about, again, community accountability and communities taking care of themselves. And I know sometimes it just sounds really radical. Like, how could we keep our neighborhoods or our schools or anything safe without an armed guard or without police? And that's the conversation that, the recent movement has really started in our communities is there another way? Like, you know, do we only follow, you know, do we only not hurt each other because we're scared of breaking the law? Or do we actually really take care of each other? And how can we model that truth in our schools?
Right. Thank you. Family, we are joined. This is not a mistake. You are tuned in to Parent Power Hour. Yes, we are missing the face of our franchise, but we are joined by Miss Sally Lee of Teachers Unite, who is talking to us about some of the things that she and her organization are doing to make the education environment not only safer physically, but also much better in terms of relationship between students and staff, and move away from police in the building. I wanted to ask you about your student recruitment. How did you recruit students to be a part of Teachers Unite and some of the decisions that are being made?
Our members are mainly teachers, so I do want to be clear with that. The way that we're able to work with students is through the coalition that we're part of, Dignity in Schools, Campaign New York, or DNC New York, if I start throwing around the acronyms. And that is a way that actually our members feel excited to be often working with young people in a way that doesn't, in some ways, compromise their jobs, right? Because there's a power dynamic in play if teachers start organizing students or their own students. And we do have some of that in the sense that many of our members have helped advise or support student-led peer mediation groups, restorative justice, student-led restorative justice practices, or circle keepers, or whatever there might be at a given school. And so often we have had, for example, we have a participatory action research project happening now, and some of that participation came from our members and a group of their students as experts who have been leading that kind of restorative justice work in their schools. So there is some of that, but I wouldn't call those students our members as much as our student allies. And we do try to encourage those students to look into organizations around the city, like Drum, South Asian Youth Organizing, or Citizen Brothers United in the Bronx, or a host of organizations around the city that we work in coalition with.
Okay, well, forgive me. I thought that the young people were part of that, which
I
guess
talking about them.
Right. And I mean, they are. They can't obviously be members, but they are, who we're trying to protect and to empower. I wanted to ask you, do you sense that Teachers Unite, do you sense there's some traction in the movement that you're, trying to facilitate here?
Yeah, I mean, definitely recently. I mean, in early June, we co-organized with our allies a march of 1,000, mostly teachers, also young people and community members, but, completely focused on getting cops out of schools, completely under the literal banner of Black Student Lives Matter, defund NYPD, fund New York schools. And that as I mentioned, I've been doing this work 14 years, never seen that kind of, and this is during the pandemic. I mean, this is 1,000 people wearing face masks on a hot day, walking, marching up the street. I had never seen that kind of mobilization or traction. And of course, with that, I mean, and the number of actions we were having and the way it was shifting and pressuring the conversations among our city council and our panel for educational policy was really, I hadn't seen it before in New York City. Again, I've been doing this for a while. But of course that does bring up new conversations, which I think as a, what about the school safety agents we like, and just people started pushing back on like, well, I don't want them to lose their jobs. And then we started to say, well, okay, how do we add nuance to our message about getting cops out of school? It isn't like, we don't like this amazing person who happens to occupy this unionized job that, that's maybe the most accessible job in that community. That's not our position. Our position is there a way we can reimagine what that person could do in our school? Could that person be a youth advocate? Could that person be a peace builder? Could that person maybe pursue a career in social work? Is there a way we can start fast tracking and facilitating rather, folks in our community having really meaningful supportive positions in schools? And so that's the conversation that I feel like is sparked by the traction that we've gained.
Thank you. And this question may be philosophical. I'm gonna put you on the spot here, but given all the movements around the country that are happening, seemingly spontaneous, what would you say you think the reason is for the traction that you all are gaining now? Do you think it is tied to just a moment in time right now in our nation, or is there something smaller going on at the New York City level that's been happening? And this is, what would you say?
I think that organizing has been happening, and that it's a matter of, when these well-publicized vicious murders happen by police at the hands of cops, is there a movement ready and organized to sort of help, not contain, but to steer and lift up the outrage that is felt by people that maybe don't spend every day thinking about, terms like school to prison pipeline, you know what I mean? And that kind of jargon. And so actually, I wish I had a visual aid that I could reach and show you, but Teachers Unite, we had the honor of contributing to a book with youth and parent and advocate writers. It's called Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out, Voices from the Front Line of the Educational Justice Movement. Don't punish me if I got that title not perfectly right. I think I got it right. And I think that book sort of captures, just in the past few years, work that's been happening, including, work in Baltimore. I'm aware of the Baltimore Algebra Project. I don't know too much about work in Baltimore, but work that's been happening on the issue of criminalization in schools. And I think, and so, of course, Black Lives Matters and that movement and that organizing and that framing and that messaging has been developing for a matter of years. And so we have these moments where there's a spark, and the work that we've been building together is able to go with it, to run with it a bit. And so I think there's been a slowly growing abolition movement in this country. And I think more recently, this gave us a little bit more of a platform to say, defund police. And it's not a new call, but suddenly there's a larger stage to say that on.
I had another question, but since you just said that, let me follow up, because people here, and I had this discussion with Rebecca not too long ago. Shout out to Rebecca, our esteemed producer. The term defund the police. What does that mean? And I obviously you go from state to state, city to city, municipality to municipality, may be different for any of those entities. But when you say defund the police, what is it that you mean?
Definitely shrink the amount of money that's given to the police. And that was part of the outrage of our campaign actions in this past spring, was that Mayor de Blasio had put forward, the proposed budget. And then, especially after COVID hit, all these agencies getting slashed. There's a hiring freeze on teachers. There's, they were threatening the summer youth jobs program we have in New York City, but the cops weren't getting touched. They were barely getting touched. And just this idea of it is a philosophical question. What are our priorities as a society, but certainly in our city, especially in this moment when we see what police mean to different neighborhoods and to different people, but everyone else gets cut. All the vital agencies that we need to survive in our city, but police go untouched. And so defund the police means at least cut their funds and let our schools continue. We're going to need funding more than ever. With students coming back, they're going to need the grief counseling and the social work and more teachers, not less. And they're going to need teachers that they've seen before. Some of the teachers have died. We need as many consistent faces and more of an adult-student ratio than before. I mean, I'm not even talking about the reopening issue right now. I'm just talking about what, how we were feeling early, more in the spring. And so Critical Resistance is an organization, an abolitionist organization that has branches across the country. And I think their website is criticalresistance.org. They have an excellent resource that talks about what are reformist demands and what are abolitionist demands. And I find it a very useful guide. And, an abolitionist demand is something that says, we want to curtail, we want to shrink, we want to shrink our reliance on policing. And we want funding and emphasis on a new way of defining safety. Does that answer the question a bit?
It does. I was going to ask about restorative practices. You mentioned that it's not just a program. Again, it's not just a hot phrase, but it is something that, if done properly, can really be utilized to bring about change. Can you talk about restorative justice, restorative practices as you see it, and how it's working in the places that you mentioned in New York?
Mm-hmm. And I, can mostly speak about it in terms of schools. I'm not an expert in how folks have been trying to bring it into the criminal justice sphere.
Sure.
But, when I started Teachers Night, with other teachers, we were started looking at the issue of criminalization of youth, of Black and brown youth. And I don't know if we knew the term. Did we know then the term restorative justice? We were looking at what makes schools safe. You know, we don't think it's metal detectors. We think it's small class size. We don't think it's, you know, armed guards or anything. We think it's, you know, having supportive staff in a school. And it was really our members who started researching other ways. How do we interrupt suspensions and the over-reliance on suspensions? And, you know, already, of course, there had been feminist organizing, Black feminist organizing, Indigenous organizing around how to do these community-based, there isn't even language, like there isn't even a verb, how to embrace another philosophy of how communities keep themselves safe. And our understanding was that the core values of transformative justice really is uprooting oppression, respecting all voices, really supporting collaborative leadership, and community accountability. And so we have a ton of members teachers who work in schools and their principals as well, who work in schools where they were really trying to move in that direction. We actually made a documentary about it, Growing Fairness, which I can send more information about. It's on our website, about how schools were, again, not with absolutely no support from the Department of Ed at the time, but just reallocating their own budgets, figuring out their own schedules, how to deal with conflict in a different way, how to deal with student removal from a classroom in another way, in a way that could begin to repair the harm done by a conflict, or restore justice, right? Or transform justice, rather than punish, right? And just remove the student, demoralize them, stigmatize them, or perhaps, you know, refer them to the criminal justice system. And so we've developed a toolkit. Our members documented testimonials and actual tools that they created in their schools to sort of build this practice. What we then saw was the city say, oh, we're doing restorative justice now here, you know, or the city council gave however many $1 million. And that, I think, pretty much entirely went to different nonprofits who had, you know, maybe folks who were trained in some conflict resolution, and they'd sort of bring in an outside person to be a restorative justice coordinator in a school, but that person wasn't really part of the school community. And so we haven't heard much transformative impacts by that kind of top down, we're doing this program now kind of approach. Oh, are you mute?
Sorry. When the city gave that money for restorative justice, were the police involved in the training as to how to do that?
A good question. My understanding is no. They're one of our coalition partners, Parent Action Committee up in the Bronx. They, I know, worked to train local SSAs in the South Bronx in some restorative justice practices, I believe, or at least in conflict de-escalation. And referring back to that resource I mentioned about reformist approaches versus abolitionist approaching, you know, that's a real tension, I think, in our organizing work. If whether that is something we would advocate for. Do we want to train police and SSAs in restorative justice, or no, do we want to shrink and make policing and build less of a reliance on policing? You know, like we're all small organizations. What are we dedicating our energy to doing? So that my understanding is that it wasn't part of, excuse me if you hear my kids in the background.
Quite all right. Live TV. We say it every week, live TV.
I mean, it's Parent Power Hour is the name of the program.
So everybody understands.
Parent Power, close the door. You can still hear my kids. So yeah, as my understanding is that the SSA force was not part of any restorative justice initiative. And yeah, that's still a conversation about whether or not that's part of the retraining of SSAs now that they are apparently going to be transferred to the DOE supervision.
To what degree is Teachers Unite To what degree are you involved in legislation or trying to get people at the local legislature to, create these things into becoming school law or law?
Excellent question. Well, every year with Dignity in Schools Campaign New York, we're fighting around budget. We're fighting for city council to support our, demands as they pertain to the city budget. What we have in New York is mayoral control of schools, which means that parents certainly don't have real levers of democracy or in changing educational policy. Mayoral control is decided at the state level. I am hoping beyond hope that it will, you can never get enough people to really organize to fight against it. Just talking about school governance as of now has not been a sexy issue that folks get really rallied up about, especially when there's such a prevailing idea that, oh, well, we used to have these local school boards and they were really corrupt. I'd say that's a really skewed myth, and I could talk more about that, but you don't want to, well, maybe you want to get me started on mayoral control, but I will really go off on it. And so it's difficult to impact city education policy. There's a panel for education policy that's the majority is appointed by the mayor. And when this was all started under Mayor Bloomberg, who certainly fired members when they weren't going to vote his way. So it's seen as a rubber stamp board. So it is difficult to impact citywide education policy because of that.
I see. And finally, what, I don't know, tips or nuggets of wisdom could you provide some of our audience in terms of organizing, and trying to make a change in this? Baltimore City, we do have some issues with school police, but it is not, on the same level as some urban areas. And I don't want to present that we have as many. We do have some, but what kind of things would you tell the parents and some of the organizers in that vein?
I'm a big fan of advocating for something that a lot of people groan when I say it. In New York City, we have school leadership teams, and I feel like in Baltimore, you have, I don't know the term, but there's any sort of parent engagement process that's more enshrined in the public school system, those levers of democracy I was talking about before. I am a big proponent of parents seizing that apparatus, if you will, and making them work. I know it's the same here in New York that a lot of, I don't know if you call them local school councils. I think that's what they're called in Boston. I mean, in Chicago. I know in New York, they are usually where the principals wield power, or a lot of not democracy or not consensus decision-making happens. But I know in New York that the actual policy that spells out what those bodies are for is really pretty impressive. And there is even a stipend given in New York to parents for participating in those that a lot of time people don't even know. And so educating yourself about even the parent association at your school, those are often seen as fundraising, places to fundraise. But I would really love to see here, certainly, and anywhere else, a movement for real parent unions and student unions that work with the teacher unions in our cities to more powerfully organize and build pressure around shared demands. And I think if we saw our parent associations, our PTAs, what have you, more as those kinds of spaces for organizing, it could be pretty fearsome. And so I actually don't know what the culture of parent associations and such are in Baltimore, but I know that generally speaking, that's not how they're seen. And so you see this kind of explosion of 501c3s like Teachers Unite, not meaning nonprofit organizations that receive funding and sort of live in this other space that are developing, however many members you can. And I would like to see this sort of nonprofit educational justice movement do more to develop leaders to go back into their schools and organize in those school-based places. Do you know what I mean?
I do. And is Teachers Unite pretty much arm in arm with the teachers unions of New York and other?
No, we are pro-union. We are very pro-union. And we very much, because of all this activity, actually, this past spring, and all this new membership and new leadership, that we have a renewed sort of citywide Teachers Unite grouping that's looking at how do we impact our union to be more, I don't know about arm in arm, but our leadership to really hear us. Because I think, as we've seen in teacher unions around the country, there's a real growing disconnect between the leadership and the rank and file. And you see that specifically around racial justice issues. And so we are, again, pro-union, but we would like to we want our members to really speak up and hold their union leadership accountable in alliance with students and parents, because that's really the most powerful way our members can be real accomplices to parents and young people demanding educational justice. That's the big lever of power here in New York City education. I mean, the UFT, our union, is that's it. The city, the mayor, they don't really have to listen to our members so much. They don't they can as voters and what have you, but our union is gigantic. And so it's our leadership that needs to feel the heat from their own membership, and that, that heat needs to be developed and shaped by their relationships with low-income communities in our city that are the most underserved by our school system.
Ms. Sally Lee of Teachers Unite, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for all of the hard work that you're doing in New York and sharing with us how Baltimore can also continue the work that we're doing with our great parents out there as well.
It's been a real pleasure. I don't know Baltimore well, but my grandfather was from Baltimore, so I've always felt a special place in my heart. I hope to get to meet you all in person someday,
Yes, hopefully. Thank you, folks, for Parent Power Hour tuning in. Despite the fact that we don't have our good friend Tyrone with us, we appreciate you. There's actually a town hall next Saturday. You can look at Sankofa School for this town hall. I mentioned it a couple of shows ago. The Sankofa School of Excellence will be opening its doors in 2022. Please check that out at Sankofa Schools. Thank you very much, family, for tuning in. We will see you at Tyrone's house. I promise you, Tyrone will be there this Thursday at 5 o'clock. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be well, everybody. Peace.